Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to Committee Corner. This is episode 11. I'm Stephanie Hamilton, NSPE's Government Relations and Advocacy Manager. And for this episode of Committee Corner, I want to talk about a markup that happened in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, specific to HR 3684, which is the Invest in America Act. So I know we've talked to you a lot already about the House T&I committee because there's just so much legislation that passes through that committee that's relevant to NSPE members. But just a kind of a quick overview of some of the basics. The chairman of House T&I is Congressman Peter DeFazio, and the ranking member is Congressman Sam Graves. The jurisdiction for this committee includes things like transportation, kind of generally, also the Coast Guard, inland waterways, and flood control and improvement. Now, as I mentioned, this particular meeting was a markup, and they were marking up several bills. The one that I want to talk about today is HR 3684. As I mentioned, it's called the Invest in America Act. And I wanted to talk about this one not only because it's relevant to NSPE members, but frankly, there are also just some interesting procedural things that are happening with this bill. And I just wanted to have an opportunity to kind of nerd out on him a little bit and talk to you about some of the procedural things within the congressional legislative process. So as I mentioned, HR 3684 is an infrastructure bill. It authorizes $715 billion in funding for several different types of infrastructure, including roads and bridges, electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, passenger and freight rail, and then also wastewater and drinking water infrastructure and assistance. And those last two are interesting because you might remember that a couple of months ago, we talked to you all about a Senate bill, S914, that was also about drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. And in fact, we actually had an advocacy campaign that was up and running when S914 was up for a vote in the Senate. S914 was actually voted out of the Senate and sent to the House. There hasn't been any activity on it on the House side, and we think that it's because the House was working on HR 3684 and already had that process going, and so they were just going to continue with their own bill and their own language. So the first interesting procedural thing that happened with this bill is during the markup, Chairman DeFazio offered something called an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Now, amendments are kind of what happens in a markup. That's the purpose. Not only is the existing language debated, but if members of the committee have things that they want changed, the markup is where they change them. And so amendments are very common, either to strike language or to add something new, and sometimes even just simply make technical corrections if there are references to statutes that don't quite line up or something like that. In this case, as I mentioned, Chairman DeFazio offered an amendment in the nature of a substitute. And what that means is that he was essentially offering a completely new version of this bill. And so an amendment in the nature of a substitute essentially erases all of the original language and replaces it with completely new language. And usually the reason that that's done, and it can be done either by a committee member, but sometimes it's also a party decision. If either Democrats or Republicans want to make substantive changes to a bill, they'll do it by using an amendment in the nature of a substitute. In this case, Chairman DeFazio offered it, and I wanted to give a visual for sort of what the changes looked like. So at the very beginning of the bill, each section and the title of each section is listed out. So this is what the last three sections, kind of the end of that table of contents list. This is what the original version looked like. And then the amendment in the nature of a substitute that Chairman DeFazio offered looked like this. So as you can see, what had been sections 1633 and 1634 became 1639 and 1640, and there were several new sections that were added. And so as you can see, it's a pretty substantial change, which is why it was done with an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Because this way, it prevents the committee from having to have independent votes for every single section and every single language change that Chairman DeFazio wanted to make to the bill. So instead of having to do that, which would have made a very long markup even longer, which is kind of hard to fathom, it just streamlines the process when there's a substantial change that somebody wants to make. And so in this instance, Chairman DeFazio offered his amendment in the nature of a substitute. That amendment was voted on and accepted. And then the final version of HR 3684 was also voted out of committee with a final vote of 38 yeses and 26 noes. So it now goes to the full House for a vote. It's already been put on the House schedule, and the rules for debate have already been established as well. So it's moving pretty quickly. And so now we get to the other interesting procedural thing that I wanted to have an opportunity to chat about. And that is what happens if HR 3684 passes. Because now what it means is that the Senate and the House have each passed different versions of legislative language that deal with the same things. They will both have passed legislation that addresses not only drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, but roads and bridges and some of the other things. And so when that happens, what they have to do is they have to pull together what's called a conference committee. And a conference committee is comprised of members from the committees of jurisdiction from each chamber, along with party leadership. So for example, if HR 3684 passes, it means that the House and Senate will have to convene a conference committee. And that committee will be comprised of members from the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, along with both Democratic and Republican party leadership. The goal of a conference committee is to develop final language that both chambers will vote on. So this conference committee they'll come together, they will debate the language in both bills, certainly make changes, combine some of that, maybe add some other things, and come up with a final version. So essentially what you'll have is 3684 and 914 coming together and forming something completely new. And then once that new bill has been created, that new bill then has to go back to both the House and the Senate. They both have to vote on and approve that bill before it can go to the president for either his signature or veto. So kind of interesting, at least for me, and for anybody else who might also be a policy wonk. So I wanted to take some time and talk about it. Because the other encouraging thing, though a conference committee makes the legislative process even longer, the encouraging thing about it is that if a conference committee happens, it means that legislation is moving, and it usually means that there's bipartisanship happening. You know, there are members of both parties working together to get a piece of legislation voted out of a particular chamber. So while it does add some time to the overall process for a particular bill, it's actually a really good sign because it means that things are moving. So we're going to keep our fingers crossed and keep an eye on HR 3684. If we hear that it's coming for a vote, you can be sure that we will have an advocacy campaign around that one too. So please be checking back to our advocacy center often. There's a lot happening with infrastructure right now, as I'm sure you are all well aware of, because it's in the news every single day. So please be checking the advocacy center pretty often, because as new things come up, we'll be creating some new advocacy campaigns and trying to build some, momentum around some of these bills so that we can get the infrastructure funding that we need. And so that does it for this episode of Committee Corner. Thanks for hanging with me through all that stuff. I appreciate you guys sticking around for that. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me or to Margaret. We're always happy to answer any questions that you have or talk about anything in more detail. So please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we will see you next time. Thanks so much.